Today's main lesson is about sampling and randomization. You've just been introduced to the data science process, an easy 7-step process that basically makes you a data scientist for 3 easy payments of school tuition, right? If only it were that simple. You will continue to return to these 7 steps for doing data science over and over, learning more with each new problem you tackle, gaining nuance along the way. Whether you're conducting research for a company someday or doing analytics on a product, you'll need to develop your research design skills, knowing what the problem is, what data you'll need to answer it, how to set up the variables and experiment so that you can answer that problem, and which tests and models to use. One of the key skills you'll be developing is understanding and applying empirical frameworks to answer a question. So for this video, let's think about answering the question, what is the average salary for a data scientist? The first thing that might come to mind is where? Just looking within the United States, a salary in Seattle, Washington is different from a salary in Rochester, New York, and different still from a salary in San Francisco, California, or Atlanta, Georgia. Another question might be, who? You may have heard of something called the gender pay gap, which refers to an overall lower salary for women than men, with an even bigger effect when race is taken into account. Naturally, as a non-binary data scientist, I'd like to see even more gender minorities represented in the data, because I'm curious about how being openly transgender affects salary as well. Might I throw in yet another question? When? At the time I'm making this video, we are in the midst of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, and everything is topsy-turvy, including discussion about cost of living adjustments in wages when workers are remote and could be living anywhere. As you can see, this seemingly simple question is actually quite nuanced. In addition, we are already coming up with a few variables we need to take into account when developing an answer to this question. More on that later. Let's go over a few basic empirical frameworks that are commonly used in data science. Experimental. Experimental studies involve controlling the design of the data collection environment, such as what variables to measure, and they rely on the ability to randomize participants to different conditions to allow for comparisons between groups and causal explanations for differences. For our question, this would be hard to do. Imagine an experimental setup where we take a set of recent college graduates and we were able to randomly assign some of those students data science skills. We could then measure the average salaries of the data science students and compare those salaries to other recent graduates. Also imagine an experimental setup where we recruit a bunch of data science graduates of different genders and randomly assign them to data science jobs. After a few months, you might survey them to measure their starting and current salaries. Of course, there may be other individual and institutional factors that may be hard to measure and affect these salaries, like company culture, promotions, or personality. A different approach would be to conduct an observational study, where we collect data in a way that does not interfere with how that data naturally arises. We can't gather any causal information without an experimental setup, but the results are still useful to see what's going on in the world. For example, you could send surveys to recent data science graduates and current data scientists working in a range of industries and companies to gather information about their salary, along with personal and organizational characteristics. Designing an experimental study to determine average salaries for data scientists clearly has its challenges, so let's approach this with an observational study. How do we measure the characteristics or variables that we are interested in? Salary seems pretty straightforward, but we should be clear for participants whether we want them to report salary or total compensation. I'm not sure we can really go around getting everyone's pay slips to get the exact amount. Instead, we will have to rely on our study participants to self-report salaries. Lots and lots of data we encounter as data scientists is measured through participant self-report. Measuring things is hard. Measurement is the process of assigning a number or label to units of analysis in order to represent conceptual properties. For example, we're looking for a number of dollars to represent a data scientist's earnings. It is important to talk about the reliability and validity of measurements. Yet again, this is a dimension of really getting to know your data. Does the measurement actually get at what you want to measure? In our case, we want to understand how data scientists are compensated for their work. Asking for salaries is well-founded, but there are elements of compensation that might be missed in doing so. For example, some data scientists work at companies that provide coffee, daycare, healthcare. These perks aren't captured by salary alone. Self-reported values also have other concerns, such as social desirability bias. If I ask you how much money you make, do you exaggerate or misremember? Another important thing to consider that we usually don't talk about is participant trust and the use of the data. It is important that the participant knows why you are collecting the data and how it might be used. So often we have some generic demographics questions without real purpose, which could later be used in harmful ways. Imagine a single parent worried that the government will think that they are not making enough income to support their kids, exaggerating their income to avoid further questions. Gender and race are potentially sensitive and not straightforward, and answers may change depending on how the data is going to be used. Reliability is the overall consistency of a measure. If you were to measure the same thing more than once, does your measurement give the same value each time? If I ask you on Tuesday how much money you make, and I ask you the day after you get your paycheck how much money you make, do you give the same answer? One way to understand and remember the difference between validity and reliability is to think about measurement as a target. You want to hit the center of the target and do so over and over. Measurements, though, could be valid but not reliably, and so on. Now back to our study. If we could ask every single data scientist in the world how much money they make and take the average, we would be very confident in our average salary. Unfortunately, we almost never have the ability to collect data on an entire population of interest. Instead, we have to get a representative sample. In science, we are usually trying to find a sample that adequately represents a true population. The findings on our sample should generalize well to other samples and hopefully to the entire population. Our population is data scientists. We might narrow down further and say data scientists in the United States. And then to be even more narrow in our inclusion criteria, we can say data scientists in the United States with less than 5 years experience. To ensure a representative sample, we would have to sample randomly from among all members of the population of interest. This is a huge challenge. Maybe you have a survey that Microsoft agrees to distribute to their data scientists. It's sent out to their emails and they can opt in to help a student with their research. Here's where selection bias comes in. There is a risk that data scientists who make less money won't respond to the survey, perhaps because it's uncomfortable to talk about. Or it could be that data scientists who have time to respond to random surveys aren't the highest paid. Maybe it was just that the email was sent on a Tuesday, and most data scientists have big meetings on Tuesdays, and the email got lost in their inbox. You are also only sampling data scientists at Microsoft in this scenario. This is tougher than we thought, isn't it? You might instead choose a list of companies across the country and reach out to them for their average starting salary for data scientists. Here's where we might start veering off from validity of measurement, because now we are asking hiring departments instead of data scientists themselves. This might be the way to go because we can get a wide range of locations and company sizes and not have to nose into people's business. But without individual responses, we would never be able to detect any pay gaps, which usually occur after contract negotiation. We have all these issues to consider when it comes to sampling, and this is just looking for one average value. This is just the start of looking at the data science process, but you're further along in your journey than you were 10 minutes ago. We have focused here on the two basic empirical frameworks, experiments and observational studies. We talked a little bit about randomization and sampling. You will see more of these ideas in the next sections. Thanks for joining me.